Thanks very much for the introduction. Well, I've drawn a pretty tough lot here with the last gig on the last day of the conference just before afternoon tea and the day after the conference dinner. But look, stay strong, stick with me for 20 minutes and I'll do my level best not to send you all asleep through this next bit of presentation. So look, today just talking about I guess the intersect of climate change policy and the waste sector, both from the perspective of opportunities for the waste sector and challenges that might face the waste sector with emerging policy developments over time. Emissions reduction or carbon policy in Australia has been a constantly evolving beast and continues to be so. So just to give you a very brief history of some of the key policy elements as we know them today. So since 2007, the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act has been in operation, and hopefully it sat through one of my co-presenters' presentations earlier in this session, where he gave a very good overview of how the NGA's reporting actually works. But there are a number of waste-related operators that are captured by NGAs. Fundamentally, if your facility is emitting more than 25,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas abatement per annum, which many landfills, for example, do, then you have an obligation to report your emissions to the Commonwealth. So we're up to, close to 10 years of that having been operating now in a real sense. From 2012 to 15, we briefly had a Commonwealth legislated carbon pricing mechanism in Australia. And under that, again, thresholds were established where if your greenhouse emissions exceeded those, you would be paying a penalty for every tonne of greenhouse emissions that you were emitting. A number of landfill players were captured under that, and an interesting aspect of history there. To compensate for that, many operators applied additional levies, either through council rates or at the landfill gate. Those levies were used to future-proof against future liability. So it was a period where basically the levies created a bunch of money that was ultimately additional or surplus to a requirement because the Australian carbon pricing mechanism was rescinded. And subsequently, those parties who were collecting those levies bought a whole bunch of carbon offsets and did voluntary carbon offsetting with those levies. So, since 2014, I guess we've moved from what I would call the stick-based approach with a carbon pricing mechanism, you're penalised for greenhouse emissions, to what I think of as a carrot-based approach, which is the Emissions Reduction Fund. Essentially, a bunch of money made available by the Commonwealth seeking to incentivise greenhouse-reducing activities by creating a market or a demand for carbon credits and paying for those carbon credits. So fundamentally, if you are a taxpayer in this room, you are contributing to a fund that is being used to buy carbon credits that's helping Australia reduce their emissions. So well done all. So the Emissions Reduction Fund, what is it? There's a few things going on in there. Firstly, it sets out through something called the Carbon Farming Act and a bunch of regulations the rules of the game for what's eligible to create carbon credits that would be recognised by the Commonwealth for purchase through the Emissions Reduction Fund. Sitting under that are a series of 35 methods that have been approved by the Commonwealth, and each of these methods spells out in very fine detail the types of activities that are eligible, and how you go about accounting for how much carbon you can receive carbon credits for, and the type of records and information you need to present to auditors to verify those claims. Of those, there are 4 methods that are related to the waste sector. Importantly, it's a big chunk of money as well, $2.55 billion, which the Commonwealth is using to purchase through a series of forward abatement contracts or forward sales contracts, carbon credits. So these contracts can run for up to 10 years. So we can see that $2.5 billion essentially will be paid out over a period of about 10 years to those parties that are participating under the Emissions Reduction Fund. Now, the waste sector has been in there pretty heavily, and they've done quite well for themselves. By my estimates, over the next 7 to 10 year period, out to 2022, or less than 10 years, you will see around $500 million flowing into the waste sector from payments for carbon credits generated and sold under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So it's a pretty significant amount of money. So coming to the types of activities that are eligible, the first one of these relates to wastewater and wastewater treatment. Effectively, if you've got lagoons or ponds with anaerobic conditions that are producing methane, if you cover those ponds and harvest and flare the methane or destroy the methane, even better, use it for energy production, that's potentially an eligible activity. Introducing new source separation. So for example, introducing a new bin system within a new municipality where you're actually collecting organics for the first time, potentially that is an eligible activity as well. So fundamentally, diversion, undertaking something new where you are diverting organics from landfill. Now importantly, introducing the source separation activity itself isn't the whole story. You do also have to prove that it's not ending up in landfill, but instead going to an approved compost facility, for example. Alternative waste treatment, the third potentially eligible activity. This one's a bit more complicated in that there are several different activities that are allowable under this particular method. And some very finicky definitions about what those activities actually are. To try and simplify that, fundamentally, if they're closed composting or digesting systems, then that is a potentially eligible activity. If you're composting in open windrows, unfortunately, you're out of the game. If you had that compost instead in a windrow system, but you covered it with one of the engineered fabrics and it was on a cement floor, then that's potentially eligible. And I guess that highlights how fine-grained the definition of what is eligible and not eligible can be in these methods. So other things like closed digesters and closed composting systems, and also converting waste to energy are eligible under this particular activity stream. And finally, landfill gas flaring. So, and this historically has been allowed in situations where you might have a legacy site that has been capped previously, but for which you weren't necessarily capturing and flaring the methane, but you installed some new infrastructure to allow for that capture and flaring. That is a potentially eligible activity, or has been in the past. But also new sites, so new landfill sites where you may have a rolling program of capping cells and harvesting methane from cells through the life of the landfill, and parts of the landfill are still being actively used. Again, that is a potentially eligible activity as well. So whilst there are a range of activities that we've just walked through there that are potentially eligible and could potentially be deployed, the reality is that really the landfill gas flaring processes have dominated as far as participation under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So firstly, I'd just like to say the waste sector is certainly a big participant in the Emissions Reduction Fund and has done its share of heavy lifting on greenhouse emissions reductions. Waste projects account for 20% of all of the projects that have been registered under the Emissions Reduction Fund to date, of which I think at last count there are around 700 or 800 projects in total, so there is a lot of waste-related projects registered there. The sector's accounted for 37% of all of the abatement that has been delivered under the Emissions Reduction Fund to date. So the land Landfill gas sector in particular got in very early with the emissions reduction fund. They were amongst the earliest projects registered and have been a very big contributor to the amount of abatement delivered so far, and we expect that to continue for some years yet. Landfill gas, 15.6 million tonnes, to put some real numbers on it, tonnes of abatement. I've got to be careful, it's not tonnes into landfill, this is tonnes of greenhouse gas I'm talking about, just to clear that one up. The other activity that's had a bit of uptake is alternative waste treatments. So these are these closed composting systems and digesters. So around 1.1 million tonnes of abatement delivered through those for 19 projects. So whilst the opportunity's there, $500 million flowing out to 2022 to the waste sector, you know, it's a significant commercial opportunity. You know, as we saw, not every activity is being utilised, and there are pockets in the waste sector that, you know, certainly really aren't participating in the emissions reduction fund at all at this stage. So the question is why? Firstly, I think part of it relates to awareness. Not everyone's aware of this opportunity, that the emissions reduction fund exists, that you can generate real money from this activity. And linked to that is the Commonwealth have coined their own new English term called Newness. The concept here is that they really don't want to issue carbon credits and potentially money for activities that have already started or have already been happening. So the idea is it's got to be a new activity. So I have any number of conversations with people, unfortunately, where 6 months ago they installed a facility that would be perfectly suited to an emissions reduction fund project, but because they've already commissioned it, sadly, they can no longer participate because they would fail on the test of newness. It is not a new activity as far as the Commonwealth is concerned. So it's very important, if you're at all interested in exploring this, that you get some advice early on, pre-construction, and preferably pre-commissioning of those, you know, suppliers that might do construction. So as early on in the process as you can, and if you're even vaguely thinking this might be something you want to participate in, apply to register a project, because as soon as the project is registered, you can then go hell for leather on construction and you've met this newness requirement basically. So yeah, avoid those sad stories that I've talked about where people have missed out on some very significant money at times. I've just got a few examples here pulled randomly off Google searches from media releases and websites demonstrating this, I guess, and how you can trip up with this concept of newness. So a number of councils here talking about introducing, or that they have introduced, activities that would be perfectly eligible as an emissions reduction fund project. But it looks as though in these cases they haven't followed through with the project registration. Now that might be because scale isn't there, for example, or any other reasons, but as soon as you put something like this out on a website or a media release, again, if you haven't actually registered the project before you're doing this, you've really created a complicated story about why your activity is new, because the regulator does do searches, just like I have here, to check whether you've got any documented evidence that you've already started the activity you're trying to claim carbon credits for. So again, get onto it early. Another interesting problem, I'd say quite specific to the waste sector, is you need to establish who owns the carbon project and who owns the project activity. This can be surprisingly complicated in some waste situations. So one real example we've worked with, a municipality introducing some source separation activity. Through that source separation activity, they're going to be diverting organics from landfill, so potentially an eligible project. They have an independent party that comes and does the collection of those organics, and then they have a third party doing the composting within an eligible compost facility of those organics. Now, in that scenario, potentially you've got two options as to which method you go for. If you're the municipality, you can head down the source separation path, try and register a project under that. But equally, the compost facility owner, if they can demonstrate that they're increasing flow through by virtue of picking up this contract, or even better yet, expanding their facility, arguably it's they that own the project and the project activity under the alternate waste methodology. So you can see, yeah, it can get complicated, and these parties need to be talking to each other as to who is actually going to claim the carbon project and generate the carbon credits. And I would say this is quite particular to the waste sector. Similarly, another one we come across often is you may have a landfill owned by a municipality. Sometimes that's operated by the municipality or another operator. And then you might also have a third party involved who's managing the methane infrastructure and flaring activity. Again, who owns the project and the project activity there? Typically, in this case, the methane operator, and I don't know if anyone from LMS would happen to be in the room, but this is a very key part of their business model. They've been very successful in essentially linking their methane infrastructure flaring services with carbon projects, and are one of the lead developers of that project type. I'm not on commission from LMS, I'm just admiring of their business model, really. One of the other key impediments to uptake of these projects is scale. Yep, there's a pot of money there, and yes, you can navigate to it. It's challenging, but there are compliance costs associated with these projects. And, you know, our rough estimates for the 7-year crediting life of your typical waste project, waste-related project, you know, to turn on the key, you're talking about $100,000 out over that 7 years in audit fees, people's time just required to manage the compliance. So with that as a fixed cost, you know, and that's the minimum entry point, you've got to make at least $100,000 from one of these projects to even bother with it, and ideally substantially more. To give you a sense of that in terms of volume, some of the business cases we've looked at with people looking at source separation or the composting technology, you need at least a throughput of 5,000 tonnes of organic waste per annum through those systems to really start thinking seriously about a project like this. And obviously the more the better. The good news is these compliance costs are basically fixed, so if you can get large scale projects, you can really drive a whole lot of economies of scale. It costs you about the same for a mega project as it does for a small project. On further barriers, the devil is in the detail on these methods. I think the shortest one is about 26 pages long, something like that, an incredible number of formulas in them to calculate the emissions, incomings, outgoings, waste incomings, outgoings. We literally recruit consultant statisticians to build us templates to be able to navigate those formulas. It's beyond us, and we have some clever people on board. But beyond that, there can be some real finicky technical detail that rules you in or out of eligibility on these things. This picture here is from a landfill operator in Victoria we work with. They have a multi-cell site, and they are progressively putting in methane capture and flaring infrastructure as they fill and close cells. In the particular method that relates to them, just to give you an example of how challenging the logic of these can be at times, they've got an existing methane flare operating for the first 2 cells that they've closed. They want to establish a separate flare elsewhere on the site that doesn't link to the first flare, but because it doesn't link, unfortunately, that's an ineligible activity. If they had one pipe joining the two, you'd be on the right side of eligibility. So, yeah, these things can drive you a little insane, I have to say, but. And because of that insanity, most people choose to work with an emerging specialist field of the emissions reduction fund agents, and we are one example of that. So we aren't waste operators. I wouldn't know the first thing about running a landfill, but we do know an awful lot about how to apply these projects under the emissions reduction fund, how to get carbon credits out of this system, and how to monetise those in a way that the operators can be pretty hands-free. So there's a range of commercial models around that. One which has prevailed and which many of our clients find useful. It's a risk-reward share arrangement. Basically, we invest up front in helping develop the project, so meeting those compliance costs, and we take our reward as a percentage of the revenue generated from the carbon credits over time. It's a neat model because we've got skin in the game and it costs the operator nothing up front. However, it is not always a fit to council procurement processes. That kind of variant from a simple invoice for service style approach has been very challenging for many of our customers. Now, I'm running short on time, so I won't go into too much detail on this slide, only to say that carbon pricing is progressively going up. What we've got here is a series of weighted average prices being paid by the Commonwealth at each of their emissions reduction fund auctions, which happen every 6 months. There's around $270 million left in the fund, and by left it doesn't mean the money has all been spent of that $2.5 billion, only that they have forward committed much of it. But nevertheless, we think there'll be 2 more auctions in the system, giving us about 12 more months to have a shot at participating in this. I can't disclose our exact estimates, but we do believe that pricing will continue to increase because the demand remains strong from the Commonwealth, but the supply of projects coming through has really slowed down in recent times. Now I'm on my last slide there. Well, I'll jump to my last slide there, Amanda. So there's a bunch of things going on in the policy space at the moment, including revision of the safeguard mechanism potentially. So safeguard mechanism is designed to stop larger emitters from emitting above acceptable benchmarks. That may have some future impacts for the landfill sector in particular, because they are reasonably large emitters. And yeah, with an election looming, there'll be a whole bunch of new policies we expect in about 12 months' time once the election result is known. So to position for the win in the new policy space, I think it's about awareness and planning, stay on top of the policy development. Again, if you've got an idea for a project, get in early and register your project. One thing I think could be done better is cooperative models, so particularly across council boundaries. I don't know why councils can't club together and have half a dozen aggregating up their activities into the one big project. It would seem to me a sensible thing to do, but challenging in practice. I think someone mentioned earlier, unfortunately the crediting period, there was a push to try and extend that for waste management sector so that they could create carbon credits for longer than 7 years. In the case of landfill flaring, at least that doesn't look like it's going to get up. And I would certainly recommend that the sector continues to develop those methods. Again, it makes no sense that some of these technicalities I've talked about don't make a lot of logical sense. There's still room to evolve those over time and generate more opportunities for the sector. Thanks for that.